CHAPTER VIII of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 8. 1799. The Coup d'Etat. During the year 7 of the Republic, which Napoleon spent in Egypt, many important events occurred in France of which he was ignorant, on account of the interruption of communications by the English cruisers. Too royalist for the Republicans, too Republican for the Royalists, the Directory was no longer taken seriously. The Fêtes of the Luxembourg had lost their prestige, and every one was looking toward that part of the horizon where the rising sun was to appear. Although several aristocratic salons had been opened, they were but little frequented. But on the other hand, the theatres, the subscription balls, the public gardens and the cafés were crowded. All parties were awaiting the return of Bonaparte. The Parisian public was more preoccupied with the banks of the Nile than with those of the Seine. The Paris of the year 7 foreshadowed the Paris of the Consulate and of the Empire. The change in manners arrived before the change in politics. After the embarkment of her husband at Toulon, Josephine did not return directly to Paris, but went to take the waters at Plombières, where she remained 3 months. Here she received the first news of the Egyptian expedition, from the taking of Malta to the occupation of Cairo, and learned by Bonaparte's letters that she must give up the idea of rejoining him. Later she heard that the frigate Pomone, upon which she was to have sailed for Egypt, had been captured by an English cruiser upon leaving Toulon. At the end of the month of September, 1798, Josephine was back in Paris. At this time she bought for 160,000 francs the estate of Malmaison, situated near the village of Rueil. Here she passed the autumn of 1798, as well as the summer of 1799. During the winter she lived in Paris at her little hotel in the Rue de la Victoire. During the winter season in Paris, Josephine was very prominent in society. The life of the capital suited her perfectly. She loved balls, dinners, concerts, and the theatre. A perfect femme de salon, she presided with a real talent over a circle of friends and admirers. Her Thursday receptions at her hotel in the Rue de la Victoire had a well-deserved reputation. Josephine frequented the society both of the Royalists and the Republicans. She was present at all the fêtes of the Directory, and was in the good graces of the official world. Her relations with Barras continued to be excellent. With all her frivolous airs, she manoeuvred like a consummate diplomatist. The greatest of men have been helped by their wives. Without Josephine, it is possible that Napoleon would never have become Emperor. In spite of his orders to her to not mingle in political affairs, she was one of the most efficacious promoters of his plans, and during his absence she adroitly prepared for him the field of action. With the Bonapartes, Josephine showed much tact. She concealed her dislike, and had the art to keep on good terms with all the members of the family. Before his departure for Egypt, Napoleon had wished to see his mother and his brothers and sisters well settled at Paris. During his absence his mother exercised a great authority over the family. She was an energetic woman, endowed with an imperious character and an iron will firm to the point of obstinacy. Economical even to avarice for herself, she was very prodigal in everything which touched the glory of her son Napoleon. Although very kind-hearted, she appeared to be very cold. She was unable to pardon Josephine her frivolous manners, her prodigality, and her exaggerated love of dress. She would have wished for Napoleon a wife who was more serious and more economical, and regretted a marriage which she thought could not bring happiness to her son. Joseph, the eldest of the family, was a worthy man, kind and sympathetic, with courteous manners and an agreeable face. Having married an heiress, Mademoiselle Julie Clary, he possessed quite a considerable fortune for that time. After having been ambassador of the French Republic at Rome, he had returned to Paris, bringing with him his wife's sister, Mademoiselle Désirée Clary, whom Napoleon had once thought of marrying. While at Rome, her fiancé, General Dufault, had been killed 3 days before the date set for their marriage. After several months of mourning she found consolation, and in August, 1798, at the home of Joseph in Paris, she married Bernadotte, the future King of Sweden. Lucien was the youngest of the deputies of the Council of 500. He was a man of rare intelligence, of solid instruction, with a real passion for literature. In spite of his youth he exercised a great influence over his colleagues. In 1794, while filling the position of a modest employé in the warehouse of the little village of Saint Maximin, he had married the daughter of an innkeeper, Catherine Boyer. Although his wife had no education, she was pretty and sweet, and was soon able to hold her place in the most fashionable salons. Louis Bonaparte had accompanied his brother to Egypt as aide de camp, but during the course of the expedition he returned to Paris as a bearer of despatches. Although later he was to be more hostile towards Josephine than either Joseph or Lucien, at this time he was on amicable terms with his sister in law, who was already thinking of him as a son in law. The youngest of the brothers of Napoleon, Jérôme, then a boy of 15, was amiable, intelligent, and mischievous, fond of pleasure, and much bored at having young Eugène de Beauharnais constantly held up before him as a model. Madame Letitia resided with her son Joseph. Of the three sisters of Napoleon, Elisa and Pauline were both living in Paris with their husbands. The youngest sister, Caroline, was finishing her education at St. Germain, at the school of Madame Campan, where Hortense de Beauharnais was also a pupil. The Demoiselles Bonaparte had inherited the beauty of their mother, especially Pauline, who was considered the most beautiful woman in Paris. It was by no means easy for Josephine to remain on friendly, not to say affectionate terms with this numerous and powerful family. The Bonapartes had only begun to show their antagonism towards the Beauharnais, which was to cause so much friction during the Empire. Besides these family troubles, Josephine had money difficulties. She spent exorbitant sums for her toilette, and her household was marked by a strange mélange of luxury and misery. She had superb jewels, but was often short of money to pay her smallest debts. Josephine, however, with her Creole nonchalance, did not take her pecuniary embarrassment seriously. Amiable, affectionate, endowed with sweet manners and an even disposition, very kind-hearted, she could well be called a charmeuse. She never offended any one. She never entered into any discussions either on politics or on any other subject. She was devoted to her friends, and forgiving to her enemies. She had to a supreme degree the qualities that caused every one to overlook her faults. During the absence of Bonaparte in Egypt, the Directory had reversed his policy in regard to the two principal states of southern Italy. Both Rome and Naples were occupied by the French troops, and republics were established. The King of Sardinia was also compelled to abdicate and retire to his island. The alarm and indignation caused by these acts led to the formation of the second coalition against France. Russia and Austria took the leading part, and Naples, Portugal, and Turkey also entered the League, while Great Britain offered to supply money in place of troops which she was not in a position to furnish. All of these states were actuated by different motives, and there was no unanimity of action. Nevertheless, they gained several victories over the raw recruits of France. In July, 1799, an Austro-Russian army captured Mantua and Alessandria, and the following month Suvaroff gained a decisive victory at Novi and drove the French forces back to Genoa. The operations of the next few months were more favorable to the Tricolor, and Massena decisively defeated the Russian army near Zurich. 10 days before Bonaparte's return, the French armies in the north were also successful, and compelled the English to retire from Holland. Disgusted by the conduct of his allies, the Czar Paul of Russia withdrew his troops from all active operations. The difficulties of the French government, however, were rather internal than external. The finances were embarrassed, and the government was harassed by a new outbreak of the Royalists in the Vendée. The struggle between the different factions, so rudely settled by the Revolution of Fructidor, had been postponed rather than decided. The element opposed to the tyrannical methods of the Directory continued to gain ground, and even succeeded in electing a large number of the new deputies. The dearth of true statesmanship at this time was shown by the advancement of Abbé Sieyès. Perhaps no man ever attained political prominence on performances so slight as this former abbé. In the States General he had acquired a reputation as an orator from his brevity and wit, but during the Revolution his career had been insignificant. Under the Directory he was sent as ambassador to Berlin. While there, in May, 1799, he was elected to the Directory. The other directors had attempted to prevent his election, and on his return to Paris he declared his hostility to the government. He at once began to look around for a military chief to serve his purposes. His first choice, Joubert, lost his life at the battle of Novi. He next made advances to Moreau, but without much success. He succeeded, however, in gaining the adhesion of Barras. With his assistance he got rid of the 3 strongly Republican members of the Directory, in place of whom were elected Goyer, an elderly respectable advocate, Roger Ducos, a former Girondist, and Molin. Bernadotte was appointed Minister of War, and speedily raised a new army of 100,000 men. Such was the position of affairs on Bonaparte's return. On the 19 Vendémiaire, the deputies were in session at the Palais Bourbon. Suddenly one of the messengers of the Directory made his appearance, with the announcement that news had been received from Egypt. General Berthier landed at Fréjus on the 17th of this month with General Bonaparte. Nobody listened to the rest. The deputies, whatever their party, were on their feet, shouting and cheering. The galleries rang with acclamations. There was a moment of wild delight. As soon as the news spread in the city, Paris, which had been lying senseless and almost dead, sprang to her feet, quivering with delight, laughing, weeping. Men were seen exchanging frantic embraces, rushing hither and thither for news. One name was heard in every direction: Bonaparte! Bonaparte! Bonaparte had landed. Thiebaut relates that he happened to turn into the Palais Royal, and there beheld a most extraordinary sight. Men were clustered about a passer by, who shouted and gesticulated as he hurried along. Then the groups broke up, and each individual ran off like lightning, as though to deliver some miraculous piece of news. One of these, as he ran, knocked against our chronicler, and shouted to him as he fled, "General Bonaparte has landed at Fréjus!" Within an hour all Paris was making holiday, and military bands were crashing out triumphal marches in the street. On every side congratulations and embraces were exchanged. In every theatre that night an actor came upon the stage, and announced the news amidst the wild plaudits of the audience, and in every tavern glasses were emptied in honor of the return. Napoleon on his arrival at once saw the advantages of an alliance with a weak man like Sieyès, who had a great talent for intrigue, combined with small intelligence. In a short time he drew to his side all the malcontents who had lost office through the recent political changes, such as Talleyrand and Cambacérès. The former had been dismissed from office in the month of July because of his notorious acceptance of bribes from foreign governments. Most of the generals were also dissatisfied and ready for a change, with the exception of Bernadotte and Jourdan, who refused to listen to any proposals. The assistance of the great power of the police was also secured through the adhesion of the new prefect, the former regicide Fouché. With Sieyès, Barras, and Ducos as traitors in the Directory, with the ancients favorable, and the 500 under the presidency of Lucien, with the soldiers and police on his side, Napoleon's plans seemed sure of success. Immediately upon his return, Napoleon became aware of the distrust of the Directory. The very day of his arrival he went to the Luxembourg to call on the president, Goyer. Among the directors the chief of the moderate party was the former Abbé Sieyès. Moreau, celebrated for his victories, was a possible rival. Goyer invited Napoleon and Josephine to dinner to meet Sieyès, but Napoleon during the repast would not say a word to Sieyès, and did not even look in his direction. Sieyès left the table in a rage. After the dinner Moreau arrived. It was the first interview between the 2 illustrious generals, who appeared to be flattered at meeting each other. A few days later, as a token of friendship, Bonaparte sent Moreau a sabre enriched with diamonds. Napoleon was so successful in winning his good will, that the day of the 18 Brumaire Moreau guarded at the Luxembourg the directors who did not wish to take part in the coup d'état. During the preparations for the coming event, Josephine exercised a real influence over men like Barras, Goyer, Sieyès, Fouché, Moreau, and Talleyrand, and perhaps without her tact Napoleon's plans might have failed. During this period he was more simple than usual in his manners. He concealed his brilliant uniform under the gray greatcoat which was destined to become legendary. Every party thought that he was in its favor. He made use of all without attaching to any. "The Directory," he said later, "trembled at my return. I was very careful what I did. This was one of the epochs of my life when I was most careful. I saw the Abbé Sieyès and promised to put in operation his verbose constitution. I received the chiefs of the Jacobins, the agents of the Bourbons. I refused the counsels of no one, but I gave no advice except in the interest of my plans. Every one thought that he had an iron in the fire, and when I became head of the State there was not in France a party which did not feel pleased with my success." On the 4th of November Bonaparte was present at a subscription banquet which was offered to him by 500 or 600 members of the two councils. The place was the Temple de la Victoire, formerly the Church of St. Sulpice. It was not a very joyous occasion. Every one looked on, and no one had anything to say. Seated by the side of Goyer, president of the Directory, Bonaparte had an air at once sombre and bored. He ate nothing but bread, and drank only the wine brought to him by his aides de camp. He did not even remain until the end of the banquet. Rising brusquely from the table, he made a tour of the room, said a few words to some of the principal guests, and then retired. In his Souvenirs, Arnauld has described the reception that evening at the hotel in the Rue de la Victoire. Josephine did the honors of her salon with more than her usual grace. There were present men from all the parties, generals, deputies, royalists, Jacobins, and even the president of the Directory. The evening passed the same as usual. Little by little the salon became empty. Fouché and Goyer, among the last to go, took leave of Josephine, who went to her apartment. Arnauld was the last to leave. He asked Bonaparte if the affair was still set for the following day, and said that he would like to have his instructions. Napoleon replied that it had been put off until the 18th, as the ancients could not make up their minds whether to act in coöperation with him or against him. The 2 following days Bonaparte and his adherents arranged the final details of their programme, which was simple and ingenious. An article of the Constitution of the year III, then in force, authorized the ancients in case of danger to the public weal to convoke the Corps Législatif, that is both councils, outside the capital in order to be free from the influence of the mob; also to choose a general and confide to him the command of the troops who were to protect the legislature. The Constitution also provided that from the moment that such a change of the place of meeting was voted there should be no discussion of the matter between the two chambers. It was arranged that this vote should be taken by the ancients on the 18 Brumaire; that the new place of meeting should be the Palace of St. Cloud, and that Bonaparte should be put in command of the troops. The ancients were to be convoked for 8 o'clock in the Tuileries, where the meetings were held. The Council of 500, which was to meet at 11 o'clock, would thus be obliged to submit without discussion. The great question now was, how, before the vote, to bring together, the first thing in the morning, the troops who were absolutely necessary to the success of the scheme. The 17th Division, whose headquarters were at Paris, were not under Bonaparte's orders. He was not Minister of War, and had no formal command of any kind. How, without arousing suspicions, under the very eyes of the Government, could they assemble the force which was to overthrow it? Several days before, the officers of the army of Paris, and of the National Guard, had expressed a wish to pay their respects to General Bonaparte. It was decided that they should be received at his house, the 18 Brumaire, at 6 o'clock in the morning, and this very early hour was explained by a projected journey on the part of the general. 3 regiments of cavalry had also solicited the honor of parading before him. They were informed that he would pass them in review at 7 o'clock the same morning. For his trip from the house in the Rue de la Victoire to the Tuileries he needed an escort of cavalry. It was arranged that one of Napoleon's most devoted partisans, a Corsican, Colonel Sebastiani, should be invited to be present on horseback at his hotel at 5 o'clock in the morning with 200 dragoons of his regiment. Sebastiani, without asking orders from his superior officers, accepted this appointment. With a brilliant staff of generals and mounted officers, preceded and followed by the dragoons of his escort, Napoleon was to go in the morning to the Tuileries the moment that the decree was voted by the Council of the Ancients. There he would receive the chief command of all the troops in garrison at Paris and in the suburbs, and would be charged to guard the two councils during the session of the following day at St. Cloud. During the day of the 18th, Barras would also be persuaded to give his resignation, which, following those of Sieyès and Roger Ducos, would disorganize the Directory. The other 2 members would be guarded by General Moreau at the Luxembourg. It was hoped that the Council of 500 would not oppose these plans, and that the revolution, masked under such legal appearances, would be carried through without violence. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the 18th, Sébastiani sent 800 dragoons to occupy the gardens of the Tuileries and the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, while he himself, with 200 men of his regiment, took his place before the residence of General Bonaparte in the Rue de la Victoire. An hour later arrived Lefebvre, the commander of the military district. The orders had been sent to the different regiments without his knowledge, and he was surprised to perceive the dragoons of Sébastiani. But Bonaparte had no trouble in gaining him to his cause. "Here," said he, "is the Turkish sabre which I bore at the battle of the Pyramids. Accept it. Do you, who are one of the bravest defenders of our country, wish to see it perish in the hands of the lawyers who are ruining it?" Lefebvre, overcome with joy, cried, "Let us throw the lawyers at once into the river." The hotel and garden were soon filled with officers in full uniform. The only one in civilian costume was Bernadotte, who refused the solicitations of Napoleon. In the meantime, at the Tuileries, the session of the Council of the Ancients had begun at 8 o'clock. After a short debate it was voted that the Corps Législatif should meet at St. Cloud at noon on the following day, the two councils sitting in the two wings of the palace; that General Bonaparte should be charged with the execution of the present decree; and that all the troops in Paris and the vicinity should be immediately put under his orders, and furthermore that General Bonaparte should be sent for to receive his commission and take the necessary oath. As soon as this vote had been taken, a messenger was sent to summon Bonaparte from his hotel. He immediately mounted his horse, and followed by a brilliant escort, among whom could be distinguished Moreau, Macdonald, Lefebvre, Berthier, Lannes, Marmont, and Murat, he set out for the Tuileries, escorted by the dragoons of Sébastiani. There were very few people around the palace, as every one was ignorant of what was going on. The gates of the gardens, which were occupied by the troops, were closed. Bonaparte traversed the gardens, and dismounting in front of the Pavillon de l'Horloge, presented himself before the Council of the Ancients. Here he delivered a short address, in which he carefully avoided the matter of the oath to support the Constitution. Only one deputy noticed the omission, and before he had a chance to speak, the session was adjourned. Bonaparte now descended to the gardens, where he passed in review the troops, who hailed him with enthusiastic acclamations. When the Council of 500 met at 11 o'clock, the deputies learned with indignation of the decree of the ancients, but their president, Lucien Bonaparte, who had just been elected to that office in honor of his brother, stated that the Constitution was explicit on the point, and that no debate was possible. Nothing remained except to arrange to meet at St. Cloud the following day. Of the 5 directors, 2, Sieyès and Roger Ducos, had already handed in their resignations as arranged. A third, Barras, upon the demand of Talleyrand, now followed their example and left Paris for his estate, Grosbois. Very well satisfied with the events of the morning, Napoleon returned to his residence, where he found Josephine happy and reassured. All the preparations had been carried out as planned. Moreau was occupying the Luxembourg, Lannes the Tuileries, and Murat the Château of St. Cloud. The revolution carried out by Bonaparte is called in history the coup d'état of the 18 Brumaire. Nevertheless, the 18 Brumaire was only the prelude. The decisive day was that of the 19th. The night passed quietly. The following morning the route from Paris to St. Cloud was covered with troops, and carriages filled with curiosity seekers. The Château of St. Cloud was situated about 5 miles from Paris on the road to Versailles, almost under the shadow of Mont Valérien, which today is crowned by the big gray fortress which was the last stronghold of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War. The Germans were in possession of St. Cloud, and the château was destroyed by the shots from the French guns. After the war the ruined walls were torn down, and today there are only gardens where stood the palace of the Bourbons and the Bonapartes. A little before midday, Bonaparte, on horseback, was stationed in front of the château of St. Cloud at the head of his troops. The ancients were to meet on the first floor in the Galerie d'Apollon, and the 500 in the Orangerie. As the rooms were not ready at the hour set for the meeting, the chambers did not come together until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Finally, Lucien Bonaparte took his seat in the presidential chair, and the proceedings of the lower chamber opened. The only business transacted was the adoption of a resolution that the members should renew their oath to maintain the Constitution. At the same time the ancients had also met, and a proposal was put forward that the 3 vacancies in the Directory should be filled. Until this moment Bonaparte had remained secluded in a room of the palace to which he had withdrawn, but becoming dissatisfied with the appearance of affairs he now descended, and accompanied by his chief of staff, Berthier, and his secretary, Bourrienne, he presented himself at the entrance of the Council of Ancients. Here he delivered a short address which was full of blunders. More accustomed to the field of battle than to the atmosphere of a deliberate assembly, he became more and more embarrassed. Finally he was persuaded to leave the hall. He next proceeded to the Orangerie, in which the 500 were meeting. He was received with shouts of "Down with the dictator! Down with the tyrant!" and a voice cried, "Hors la loi! Outlaw him!" 5 years before, this cry had sounded the knell of Robespierre, and Bonaparte appeared lost. But Murat and his officers, with a few grenadiers, forced their way through the crowd, and escorted their general to safety. For a short time he retired again to his room, and then descended to the courtyard and mounted his horse. This entry of Bonaparte into the Council of 500 had resulted in a formal motion of outlawry, and it was fortunate for him that his brother was president of the Assembly. In this crisis, Lucien showed as much resourcefulness and coolness as Napoleon had impetuosity and rashness. He declined to receive the motion, and, claiming his right to speak, he left the presidential chair and ascended the tribune. Finding it impossible to make his voice heard against the howls of the deputies, he sent a message which resulted in the appearance of half a dozen grenadiers, who escorted him from the hall. Mounting a horse, he addressed the soldiers in ringing tones, declaring that the Assembly was dominated by a band of assassins, that his life and that of his brother were no longer safe, and that he, as president of the Assembly, called on them to restore order. He was greeted with loud shouts of "Vive Bonaparte!" Murat gave the orders, and the drums beat the charge. Followed by the infantry, Murat made for the door of the council chamber. At the sight of the troops the legislators hurried to leave the hall, most of them by the windows, and the room was soon cleared. On Sunday evening, the 10th November, 1799, immediately after the eventful day of the 19 Brumaire, a "rump" of the two councils, under the presidency of Lucien Bonaparte, met in the now deserted halls of the Palace of St. Cloud, and unanimously voted to remove the directors, and appoint in their place 3 consuls, Sieyès, Ducos, and Bonaparte. The meeting then adjourned for 4 months, after appointing a commission to co operate with the consuls in the preparation of a new constitution. Thus was fulfilled the prophecy made 8 years before by Edmund Burke in his "Reflections on the Revolution in France," that French liberty would fall a victim to the first great general who drew the eyes of all men to himself. The Constitution of the year '8, the 4th since the founding of the Republic, was hastily prepared, and went into effect a month later. It was principally the work of Bonaparte, and was designed to put supreme power in his hands. The result was the organization of the Consulate, which lasted for 5 years, from 1799 to 1804. In a plébiscite held in the early days of January, the Constitution was ratified by the overwhelming majority of over 3,000,000 votes against about 15,000 in the negative. It was a remarkable verdict of the nation, and gave Bonaparte the soundest of titles to power. At this time Sieyès and Ducos resigned their temporary positions as consuls, and were rewarded with seats in the Senate. The 2 new consuls were Cambacérès and Lebrun. The former was a learned jurist and a very tactful man. The latter was a moderate with leanings towards a constitutional monarchy. Both were to prove valuable assistants to Bonaparte, Cambacérès being entrusted with the general oversight of legislation, and Lebrun with that of finance. The new ministry included Talleyrand, Foreign Affairs; Berthier, War; Lucien Bonaparte, Interior; and Fouché, the Police. The 3 consuls, who were to serve for the term of 10 years, should have been chosen by the new Senate, but in order to put the new government into immediate operation, the Constitution designated who they should be: Bonaparte, First Consul; Cambacérès, the second; and Lebrun, the third. Practically all the executive powers were placed in the hands of the First Consul. He was to appoint ministers, ambassadors, the officers of the army and the navy, and numerous civil officers, including the judges. He had the power to make war and peace, and negotiate treaties subject to the approval of the Corps Legislatif. The First Consul was also to have the initiative in all legislation. Bills were to be prepared by a Council of State, and were then to be submitted to a tribunate, which had the right to discuss them, but not to vote them. They then went to the legislative body, which had the power to vote them, but not to discuss them. The Senate, a third body, higher than the others, was to be the guardian of the Constitution, and was also to elect the consuls, the members of the tribunate, and the legislature, through an elaborate system which it is unnecessary to describe in detail, as it was only a sham. All this elaborate machinery was designed to deceive the people, and keep up the fiction of the continued existence of the Republic. As a matter of fact, Bonaparte was sovereign in all but name. To be sure, he was only elected for 10 years, and had no power to bequeath his office to an heir, but all these details he was to arrange later. He now secured the enactment of a law which placed all local government in his hands. There was to be a prefect in charge of the civil administration of each department, a sub prefect for smaller divisions, and a mayor for every town or commune, all appointed from Paris. All local self government thus came to an end, and the executive power was centralized in the capital even more effectually than under the Bourbon monarchy. Every one was tired of the excesses of the Revolution and the continual changes in the government, and the nation was ready for a return to a safe and sane regime of law and order. The First Consul soon showed that he proposed to rally all factions to his support and adopt a non partisan and thorough national policy. All regicides were excluded from high office except a few who, like Fouché, were too valuable to be dispensed with. The émigrés of Fructidor returned, and even declared Royalists were welcomed back. Equally generous was Bonaparte's treatment of the Roman Catholic Church. Priests were allowed to return, and to officiate in places where no opposition was raised. The Royalist rising in the Vendée was finally put down, and the Breton Chouans, under their peasant leader, Georges Cadoudal, were crushed. Thus ended the civil war which for nearly 7 years had devastated the heart of France. End of Chapter 8.